The wind came down from the Bighorn Mountains, carrying the smell of pine and the promise of an early frost. It swept across the valley floor, bending the tall grass in silver waves, and climbed the gentle slope to where Clara Ashford stood alone on her porch. She did not pull her shawl tighter against the cold. She did not move at all. She simply stood there, watching the horizon as if waiting for something that would never come. 3 years had passed since the raid, 3 years since she had buried what remained of her husband Samuel in the hard Wyoming earth. 3 years since she had stopped looking for her daughter Emma and started accepting that the child was gone forever. In that time, Clara had become something less than alive but more than dead. She existed, she worked, she ate when her body demanded it, and slept when exhaustion took her. But she did not smile. She had forgotten how. The Ashford homestead sprawled across 200 acres of prime grazing land, purchased with Samuel's army pension and the savings from his years as a cavalry officer. He had dreamed of raising cattle and children here, of building something lasting on the frontier. Clara had shared that dream once. Now the cattle grazed untended, growing thin and wild. The barn needed repairs she could not make alone. The fence posts leaned like drunk men, and the winter rye had not been planted because she could not bring herself to plan for a future she did not want. Down in Broken Ridge, the townsfolk spoke of her in hushed tones. Poor Clara Ashford, they said. Grief has turned her heart to stone. Some said she had gone mad. Others said she had simply given up. The women brought casseroles she did not eat. The men offered to help with the heavy work, but she turned them away with silence and cold stares. She wanted nothing from anyone. She wanted only to be left alone with her pain. On this particular October morning, Clara had been standing on the porch for nearly an hour when she saw the rider approaching from the south road. He was still half a mile out, just a dark shape moving slowly through the golden grass, but she knew immediately that he was a stranger. There was something about the way he sat his horse, something careful and contained, that set him apart from the local ranch hands who rode with the loose confidence of men who had never questioned their place in the world. She watched him come closer. He rode a dun-colored mare that looked road-weary but well cared for. His clothes were simple and worn, the kind of sturdy work clothes that marked him as a laborer rather than a drifter. He wore his hat low against the morning sun, and she could not see his face clearly until he reined up at the edge of her property and removed the hat in a gesture of respect. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 30 years old, with sun-darkened skin and black hair that fell past his collar. His features were sharp and angular, his cheekbones high. His eyes a peculiar shade of grey that seemed to hold the colour of storm clouds. There was something in those eyes that made Clara's breath catch in her throat, something quiet and watchful and deeply, terribly familiar. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was low and measured, carrying the neutral accent of a man who had learned to speak carefully. "I heard in town you might be looking for a hand. Someone to help with the winter work." Clara said nothing. She simply looked at him, taking his measure the way she might assess a horse at auction. He did not flinch under her scrutiny. He did not look away or shuffle his feet or offer nervous explanations. He simply waited, as patient as stone. "Who told you that?" she said finally. It was not a question. "Man at the general store. Said you had more land than you could work alone. Said you might be in need of help before the snows come." Clara considered this. Hiram Jenkins at the general store had been after her for months to hire someone, warning her that she would lose everything if she did not get help with the ranch. She had ignored him as she ignored most things these days, but the truth was that he was right. The truth was that she could not face another winter alone, struggling to keep the cattle alive and the roof from caving in. The truth was that she was tired, bone-deep tired, and the thought of continuing to fight this losing battle made her want to lie down in the snow and never get up. "What's your name?" she said. "Eli Walker, ma'am. Where do you come from, Eli Walker?" He paused for just a moment, so brief that most people would not have noticed. But Clara noticed everything these days. She had learned to read the silences between words, the hesitations that betrayed hidden truths. "Here and there," he said. "Worked ranches in Montana. Before that, Nebraska. Before that, further east. You have references?" "No, ma'am. Just my word and my work." Clara studied him for another long moment. She should send him away, she knew that. There was something about this man that unsettled her, something she could not name but felt in her bones like the ache before a storm. But there was also something else, something that whispered to her through the fog of her grief. She needed help, she needed someone. And this man, whoever he was, had shown up at her door like an answer to a prayer she had forgotten how to speak. "There's a room in the barn," she said. "It's not much, but it's dry and warm. I pay $2 a week plus meals. You work sun-up to sundown, and you don't ask questions about things that aren't your concern. Can you live with that?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then put your horse in the stable and get settled. Supper's at 6. Don't be late." She turned and went back inside without another word, letting the screen door bang shut behind her. Through the window, she watched him lead his horse toward the stable, moving with that same careful, contained grace she had noticed before. He walked like a man who was used to being watched. He walked like a man who had learned to make himself small and quiet and unremarkable. Clara turned away from the window and pressed her hand against her chest, trying to still the strange flutter of her heart. It was nothing, she told herself. He was just a drifter, looking for work. There were hundreds like him on the frontier, men with no past and no future. Men who moved from place to place because staying still meant facing things they would rather forget. But even as she told herself this, she knew it was not true. There was something about Eli Walker, something that had reached through the numbness surrounding her heart and touched a nerve she had thought was dead. She did not know what it was. She did not know if it was hope or fear or something else entirely, but for the first time in 3 years, Clara Ashford felt something other than the endless grey weight of her grief, and that, perhaps more than anything else, was what frightened her most. The first week passed in a blur of hard work and harder silence. Eli proved himself to be everything he had promised and more. He was skilled with horses in a way that bordered on uncanny, able to calm even the most skittish animal with a touch and a few quiet words. He worked from dawn until dark without complaint, repairing fences, mending the barn roof, hauling water from the creek. He ate his meals in silence, answered questions with as few words as possible, and retreated to his room in the barn as soon as supper was finished. Clara watched him. She could not help herself. There was something about the way he moved, the way he held himself, that drew her attention like a moth to flame. He never looked at her directly. He never initiated conversation, but sometimes, when he thought she was not watching, she caught him staring at the photograph on the mantel, the one of Samuel and Emma taken in their Sunday best, just months before the raid. His expression in those moments was unreadable, a mask of stillness that revealed nothing. The other workers noticed him too. Clara employed 2 seasonal hands during the busy months, brothers named Tom and Jack Brennan, who came from a hard-scrabble farm on the other side of the valley. They were good men, simple men, but they had lived their whole lives on the frontier, and they knew how to read the signs of a man who was hiding something. "There's something off about that one," Tom said to Clara one evening when Eli was out checking the fence line. "Can't put my finger on it, but I don't trust him." "He does good work," Clara said. "That's not what I mean, Mrs. Ashford. I mean there's something he ain't telling us, something about where he comes from, something about who he really is." Clara said nothing. She knew Tom was right. She had felt it herself from the moment Eli had ridden up to her door, but she also knew that everyone on the frontier was running from something. Everyone had secrets, and as long as Eli did his work and kept to himself, she saw no reason to dig into matters that were none of her business. But curiosity is a persistent thing, and grief has a way of sharpening the senses even as it dulls the heart. Clara found herself watching Eli more closely, noting the small details that might reveal the truth he was hiding. She noticed that he never went into town, even when given the opportunity. She noticed that he avoided the Brennan brothers whenever possible, keeping to himself in a way that went beyond simple introversion. She noticed that he wore a leather cord around his neck, hidden beneath his shirt, and that sometimes his hand would move to touch it, as if seeking comfort from something unseen. And then on the 9th night of his employment, Clara heard him talking. She had gone to the barn to check on a mare who was close to foaling, moving quietly through the darkness with a lantern in hand. The night was cold and clear, the stars scattered across the sky like chips of ice, and her breath made small clouds in the frigid air. She was halfway to the stable when she heard the voice, low and rhythmic, coming from the direction of Eli's room. At first she thought he was singing. The sounds were melodic, rising and falling in patterns that seemed to follow rules she did not understand. But as she crept closer, pressing herself against the rough boards of the barn wall, she realized it was not singing at all. It was speaking in a language she did not recognize. No, that was not true. She did recognize it. She had heard those sounds before, 3 years ago, on the worst night of her life. The language was Lakota. Clara's heart stopped. Her blood turned to ice in her veins. She stood frozen against the barn wall, unable to move, unable to breathe, as memories she had spent 3 years trying to bury came rushing back with the force of a spring flood. The war cries in the darkness. The smell of smoke and blood. Samuel's body on the cabin floor. Emma's screams as they dragged her away into the night. The Lakota had killed her husband. The Lakota had taken her daughter. And now one of them was living in her barn, sleeping under her roof, eating the food from her table. Clara's hand found the knife she kept in her apron pocket, the small blade she carried everywhere since the raid. Her fingers closed around the handle with a grip like death. She could kill him now. She could walk into that room and drive the blade into his heart before he even knew she was there. It would be justice. It would be revenge. It would be exactly what he deserved for what his people had done to her family. But even as the thought formed in her mind, something held her back. Some small voice of reason that whispered through the red haze of her rage. She did not know for certain that Eli was Lakota. She did not know if he had anything to do with the raid. She did not know anything about him at all, except that he was good with horses and worked hard and had never shown her anything but respect. Slowly, carefully, Clara forced her fingers to release the knife. She forced her feet to carry her back to the house. She forced herself to climb the stairs to her bedroom and lie down on the bed she had once shared with Samuel. But she did not sleep. She lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing through possibilities and fears and memories she could not escape. Who was Eli Walker? Where had he come from? And what was he doing here on the homestead where her husband had been murdered and her daughter had been stolen? By the time the sun rose, Clara had made a decision. She would find out the truth. She would watch him, follow him, search his belongings if necessary. She would uncover whatever secrets he was hiding. And then, when she knew for certain who and what he was, she would decide what to do about it. She had stopped believing in God the night of the raid. She had stopped believing in justice and mercy and the basic goodness of human beings. But she still believed in one thing, the one thing that had kept her alive through 3 years of grief and despair. She believed in vengeance. And if Eli Walker had anything to do with the death of her husband and the disappearance of her daughter, she would make him pay for it with his life. The morning came gray and cold, with clouds piling up against the mountains like dirty wool. Clara rose before dawn as she always did, splashing frigid water on her face from the basin on her dresser, pulling on her work dress with fingers that trembled only slightly. In the mirror, a stranger looked back at her, a woman with hollow cheeks and eyes like burnt holes in a blanket, a woman who had aged a decade in 3 years. She went downstairs and started the fire in the cook stove, moving through the familiar motions without thought. Coffee, biscuits, salt pork and beans. The same breakfast she had made every morning since Samuel died, the same tasteless fuel to get her through another day. She heard the barn door creak open as Eli emerged for his morning chores, and she moved to the window to watch him. He walked to the pump and worked the handle, filling a bucket with water for the horses. In the pale dawn light, she studied his profile, searching for the features she remembered from that terrible night. But the raiders had been shadows, dark shapes moving through smoke and firelight. She had not seen their faces. She had only heard their voices, screaming in that strange, lilting language as they set fire to the outbuildings and dragged Emma away. Eli lifted his head suddenly, as if sensing her gaze. For a moment, their eyes met through the kitchen window. Clara felt something pass between them, some current of understanding or warning that made her skin prickle with unease. Then he looked away and went back to his work, and she was left standing at the window with her heart pounding against her ribs like a caged bird. She needed answers. She needed the truth, and she would not rest until she had it. no matter what it cost her, no matter what it cost them both. Clara spent the next 3 days watching Eli Walker with the focused intensity of a hawk circling its prey. She noted every detail of his movements, every word he spoke, every moment when he thought himself unobserved. She searched for signs of deception, for cracks in the careful mask he wore, but Eli gave nothing away. He worked. He ate. He slept. He moved through the world like a man who had learned to leave no trace of his passing. On the 4th day, Clara rode into Broken Ridge. The town was small and weathered, a collection of wooden buildings huddled together against the vastness of the prairie like sheep seeking warmth. There was a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, a small church with a crooked steeple, and a sheriff's office that always seemed to need a new coat of paint. The streets were rutted with wagon tracks and dotted with horse droppings, and the smell of wood smoke and manure hung in the air like a permanent fog. Clara tied her horse outside the general store and went inside. Hiram Jenkins looked up from behind the counter, his weathered face creasing into a smile that faded quickly when he saw her expression. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, "good to see you in town. How's that new hand working out?" "That's what I came to talk to you about," Clara said. She moved closer to the counter, lowering her voice even though the store was empty. "What do you know about him? About where he came from?" Hiram's smile disappeared entirely. He set down the jar of nails he had been counting and gave her his full attention. Not much, to tell the truth. He came through about 2 weeks ago asking around for work. Seemed like a decent sort, quiet, polite. I thought of you right away, knowing how you needed help out at the homestead. Did he say anything about his past, where he was from, who his people were? Hiram shook his head slowly. Just said he'd worked ranches up in Montana. Said he was looking for steady work and didn't mind hard labor. That's about all I got out of him. Why? He giving you trouble? Clara hesitated. She had not told anyone about what she had heard in the barn. She was not sure why. Perhaps because she wanted to be certain before she made accusations that could not be taken back. Perhaps because some part of her, some small voice she did not want to acknowledge, whispered that there might be more to the story than she understood. "No trouble," she said finally. "Just curious. You know how it is. A woman alone out there. I like to know who I'm dealing with." Hiram nodded, but his eyes remained troubled. "You want me to ask around?" "I know some folks who've done business up Montana way. Might be able to find out if anyone knows him. No, don't bother. I'm sure it's nothing." She bought some supplies she did not need and left the store before Hiram could ask any more questions. Outside, she stood on the wooden boardwalk and looked up and down the main street, trying to decide what to do next. The sheriff's office was just across the way. Sheriff Tom Rawlings had been the one to organize the posse that went after the raiders 3 years ago. He had been the one to tell her that the trail had gone cold, that Emma was probably dead, that she should try to move on with her life. Clara had hated him for that. She had hated everyone who had told her to accept the unacceptable. But now, standing in the cold October sunlight, she found herself walking toward his office without quite knowing why. The sheriff was sitting behind his desk when she came in, a cup of coffee in one hand and a stack of wanted posters in the other. He was a big man, running to fat in his middle years, with a grey mustache and tired eyes that had seen too much of the ugliness the frontier could produce. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, rising to his feet. "This is a surprise. What can I do for you?" "I need information," Clara said. She sat down in the chair across from his desk without waiting to be invited. "About the raid, about the men who attacked my homestead." Rawlings sighed heavily and sat back down. "We've been over this before, Mrs. Ashford. You know everything I know. A war party came through, probably Lakota or Cheyenne, looking for supplies and horses. They hit your place and 2 other homesteads that night. By the time we got a posse together, they were long gone. You never found any of them." "No, ma'am." "Trail went cold up near the Powder River. Could have gone anywhere from there, reservation, Canada. Back into the wilderness. There's a lot of empty country out there." Clara leaned forward. "What about half-breeds? Were there any reports of mixed-blood men riding with the war parties?" Rawlings frowned. "Half-breeds. Where's this coming from? Just answer the question, Sheriff." He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with those tired, knowing eyes. Then he set down his coffee cup and pulled open a drawer in his desk. There were rumors, he said slowly, pulling out a worn leather folder. Nothing confirmed. But some of the survivors from the other raids, they said some of the warriors seemed different, lighter-skinned. One woman swore she heard one of them speaking English, though she was half out of her mind with fear, so I don't know how much stock to put in that. Clara's heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her temples. What else? That's all I got. He handed her the folder. These are the reports from that night, everything we gathered. I should probably ask why you want to know, but I figure you've got your reasons and they're none of my business. Clara took the folder with hands that were not quite steady. Thank you, Sheriff. She was almost to the door when his voice stopped her. Mrs. Ashford, whatever you're thinking about doing, be careful. Revenge has a way of eating a person up from the inside. I've seen it happen too many times. Clara did not turn around. I'm not looking for revenge, Sheriff. I'm looking for the truth. She left before he could respond, clutching the folder to her chest like a shield against the cold wind that had begun to blow down from the mountains. The ride back to the homestead took 2 hours, and Clara spent every minute of it reading the reports. They were sparse and frustrating, full of gaps and uncertainties. The raid had happened on the night of February 15th, 1876. 3 homesteads had been attacked between midnight and dawn. 7 people had been killed, including Samuel. 4 had been taken captive, including Emma. The raiders had stolen horses, guns, and supplies. They had set fire to outbuildings, but left the main houses standing. And they had vanished into the wilderness like smoke, leaving nothing behind but grief and questions. But there was one detail in the reports that Clara had not known before. One of the other survivors, a man named Jedediah Crane, had reported that he recognized one of the raiders, not by face but by the way he moved. Crane claimed he had seen the same man 2 years earlier, working at a trading post up near the Yellowstone River. A half-breed, Crane had said, son of a white trader and a Sioux woman, went by the name of Walking Elk. Clara read that passage 3 times, her breath coming faster with each repetition. Walking Elk, Eli Walker. The names were different, but the similarity was too close to be coincidence. When she arrived back at the homestead, the sun was already sinking toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. Eli was in the corral, working with the young mare who had been too wild to let anyone near her. As Clara watched from the porch, he moved closer to the animal, his hands raised, his voice a low murmur she could not hear from this distance. The mare tossed her head nervously, but she did not bolt. She stood trembling as Eli reached out and touched her neck, running his fingers through her tangled mane. It was beautiful to watch. It was also terrifying, because Clara now understood what she had been seeing all along. Eli Walker was not just good with horses. He had a gift that went beyond training or experience. He had a connection with the animals that spoke of a different way of seeing the world, a way of seeing that came from a people who had lived on this land for thousands of years before the white settlers arrived. That night, Clara did not sleep. She sat in the rocking chair by the window, Samuel's old rifle across her knees, watching the barn until the first grey light of dawn crept over the mountains. She had made her decision. She would confront Eli. She would demand the truth. And if he was the man she suspected him to be, if he had anything to do with the raid that had destroyed her life, she would put a bullet in his heart and leave his body for the wolves. But when morning came, something unexpected happened, something that changed everything. Clara was in the kitchen making coffee and trying to work up the courage to walk out to the barn when she heard a commotion in the yard, shouts and the sound of hooves. She grabbed the rifle and ran to the door, expecting to find raiders or bandits or some other threat from the violent frontier. What she found instead was the Brennan brothers, Tom and Jack, riding hard up the drive with a third man slumped across the saddle of a horse they were leading. The man was covered in blood. "Mrs. Ashford!" Tom shouted as he reined up in front of the porch. "Found him out by the creek. He's been shot." Clara's first thought was that it was Eli. Her second thought was a surge of relief so powerful it made her knees weak. Her third thought, following hard on the heels of the second, was a wave of shame so intense she could taste it like copper in her mouth. "What happened?" she said, forcing her voice to stay steady. "Don't know," Jack said. He was climbing down from his horse, reaching up to help lower the wounded man to the ground. "Looks like he ran into some trouble. Maybe bandits, maybe worse." They laid the man on the porch and Clara finally got a good look at him. He was young, perhaps 25, with fair hair and pale skin that had gone grey from blood loss. His clothes were those of a traveller, a city man by the look of them, and he wore a leather satchel across his chest that he clutched even in his unconscious state. "Get him inside," Clara said. "Put him in the spare room. Jack, ride for the doctor. Tom, help me get his coat off so I can see how bad it is." They worked quickly, carrying the man inside and laying him on the narrow bed in the room that had once been Emma's. Clara cut away his shirt and found the wound, a bullet hole in his left side that was bleeding sluggishly but steadily. She had seen enough injuries in her years on the frontier to know that this one was serious, but not necessarily fatal, provided they could stop the bleeding and prevent infection. She was pressing a wadded cloth against the wound when she heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Eli standing in the doorway. "What happened?" he said. His voice was calm, but his eyes were fixed on the wounded man with an intensity that made Clara's skin prickle. "The Brennans found him by the creek. Shot. They've gone for the doctor." Eli nodded slowly. He moved into the room, and Clara tensed, her hand dropping instinctively to the knife at her belt. But Eli paid her no attention. He was looking at the wounded man's face, studying his features with an expression that Clara could not read. "Do you know him?" she asked. Eli did not answer immediately. He reached out and touched the leather satchel the man was still clutching, even in his unconscious state. Then he straightened up and stepped back. "No," he said. "Never seen him before." But Clara had been watching his face. She had seen the flicker of recognition in his eyes before he schooled his features into their usual mask of stillness. She had seen the way his hand had trembled, just slightly, when he touched the satchel. Eli Walker was lying, and Clara intended to find out why. The doctor arrived 2 hours later, a gruff old man named Harrison, who had been treating frontier injuries for 30 years. He examined the wound, extracted the bullet and stitched up the hole with the practiced efficiency of long experience. "He'll live," Harrison said, wiping his hands on a bloody rag. "Bullet missed anything vital. He's lost a lot of blood, though. He'll need rest and care for at least a week before he's fit to travel." Clara nodded. She would provide the care. She had no choice. But she was also determined to find out who this man was and what he was doing on her property. The stranger woke the next morning, confused and feverish, but lucid enough to answer questions. His name, he said, was Daniel Whitmore. He was a journalist from Chicago, working on a story about the Indian Wars and the fate of white captives who had been taken by the tribes. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "White captives," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, ma'am." Whitmore's eyes were bright with fever, but his voice was steady. "I've been traveling through the territories, interviewing survivors, gathering stories. The newspaper sent me to find out what happened to the children who were taken, whether any of them are still alive." Clara sat down heavily in the chair beside the bed. Her hands were shaking, and she pressed them flat against her thighs to still them. "My daughter," she said. "My daughter was taken 3 years ago, in a raid." Whitmore's expression shifted from professional interest to genuine sympathy. "I'm sorry," he said. "I've heard too many stories like yours. Parents who lost everything, who never knew what happened to their children. Do you have information? Do you know anything about the captives from the raids in '76? Whitmore hesitated. He glanced toward the door, as if checking to make sure they were alone. Then he reached for the satchel that lay on the table beside the bed. "I have documents," he said, "reports from the Indian agencies, lists of captives who have been recovered or identified. I was on my way to the Pine Ridge Reservation when I was attacked. Whoever shot me, they were trying to steal this satchel." Clara's heart was pounding so hard she could barely hear her own thoughts. "Can I see them, the documents?" Whitmore opened the satchel and pulled out a thick sheaf of papers, worn and creased from travel. He handed them to Clara with hands that trembled from weakness. "Be careful with them," he said. "They represent months of work. And some of the information in there, it could get people killed if it fell into the wrong hands." Clara took the papers and began to read. And as she read, the world she thought she knew began to crumble around her like a house built on sand. The documents were a revelation. They contained names and dates and locations, carefully recorded accounts of raids and rescues and ransoms paid. They contained descriptions of captives who had been seen living with various tribes, some of them children taken years ago who had grown into adults barely distinguishable from their captors. And they contained something else, something that made Clara's blood run cold. There was a list of individuals, white men and half-breeds, who had served as intermediaries between the tribes and the government, men who knew both worlds and moved between them like ghosts, men who had helped negotiate the return of captives, sometimes for money, sometimes for other considerations. And at the bottom of that list, written in a careful hand, was a name Clara recognized: Eli Walker. She looked up from the papers, her mind racing. Eli was not just a half-breed hiding his heritage. He was not just a man who had been present at the raids. He was something else entirely. He was a go-between, a negotiator, a man who knew where the captives were and who had the connections to bring them home. Including, perhaps, Hemas. Clara set the papers down with hands that were no longer steady. She stood up slowly, her legs trembling beneath her, and walked to the window. Outside, the sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire and blood. And somewhere out there in the vast wilderness that stretched beyond the horizon, her daughter might still be alive. For the first time in 3 years, Clara Ashford felt something stir in the frozen wasteland of her heart. It was not happiness, it was not hope. It was something rawer than that, something more dangerous. It was the possibility that everything she thought she knew was wrong. Clara found Eli in the barn, brushing down the dun mare he had ridden in on 3 weeks ago. The lantern light cast long shadows across the rough wooden walls, and the smell of hay and horse sweat hung thick in the air. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching him work, trying to find the words for what she needed to say. Eli did not look up, but she knew he was aware of her presence. He always seemed to know when someone was watching him. It was one of the things that had unsettled her from the beginning, that preternatural awareness that spoke of a life spent on the edge of danger. "I know who you are," Clara said finally. Eli's hands stilled on the horse's flank. He did not turn around. "And who is that, Mrs. Ashford? Your name isn't Eli Walker. Or maybe it is now, but it wasn't always. You were called Walking Elk. You're half-Lakota. And you were there the night my husband was killed and my daughter was taken." The silence that followed was so complete that Clara could hear her own heartbeat, loud and fast in the stillness of the barn. Eli set down the brush slowly and turned to face her. His expression was unreadable, that same mask of stillness he always wore. But something had changed in his eyes. Something had broken open. "How did you find out?" he said. "The journalist, Whitmore, he has documents, lists of people who helped negotiate the return of captives. Your name was on one of them." Eli nodded slowly, as if this was something he had been expecting. He leaned back against the stall door and crossed his arms over his chest, and for the first time since she had known him, Clara saw something like weariness in his face. "My mother was Lakota," he said. "Hunkpapa band. My father was a fur trader from Pennsylvania. He met her at a trading post on the Yellowstone when she was 15 years old. He married her in the Lakota way, which meant nothing under white law, and he left her when I was 7. I grew up in my mother's village, learning her ways, speaking her language. But I never belonged there, not really. I was too white for the Lakota and too Indian for the whites. I didn't belong anywhere." Clara's hand was resting on the knife at her belt, but she did not draw it. Not yet. "Keep talking," she said. "When I was 16, I went to find my father. I wanted to understand why he had abandoned us. I traveled east, worked odd jobs, learned to pass as white when I needed to. I found him in St. Louis. He had a new family by then, a white wife, white children. He didn't want anything to do with me. He gave me $50 and told me never to come back." Eli's voice was flat, emotionless, as if he were recounting events that had happened to someone else. But Clara could see the pain beneath the words, the old wounds that had never fully healed. "I came back west," he continued. "I worked as a scout for the army for a while, then as a translator at the Indian agencies. I was useful because I could move between both worlds. I could speak to the Lakota in their own language, understand their ways, and I could explain them to the whites in terms they could understand. When the war started getting bad, when the raids increased, I started helping with the negotiations." What kind of negotiations? Clara asked. Ransom negotiations. When the tribes took white captives, sometimes they were willing to trade them back. For guns, horses, supplies. Sometimes for nothing at all, just a promise that the army would leave them alone for a while. I was one of the people who helped arrange those trades. Clara felt her heart lurch in her chest. You helped bring captives home. Some of them. Not all. Not enough. His voice cracked on the last word, and Clara saw something flash across his face. Guilt. Grief. The same emotions that had been eating her alive for 3 years. What about my daughter? Clara said. Her voice was barely a whisper. What about Emma? Eli looked at her then, really looked at her, and what she saw in his eyes made her breath catch in her throat. It was sorrow. Deep, profound sorrow that seemed to go all the way down to the bone. I was there that night, he said. Not during the raid itself. I was camped about 5 miles away, traveling with a group of Lakota who were heading north to join Sitting Bull. I heard about what happened the next morning. By the time I got to your homestead, the army was already there and your husband was already dead. Clara's legs gave out beneath her. She sat down hard on a bale of hay, her hands pressed flat against her thighs to stop them from shaking. You saw, she said. You saw what they did. I saw the aftermath, the burned buildings, the bodies, and I saw them carrying the captives away. 4 of them, 2 women and 2 children. Clara closed her eyes. She could feel the tears burning behind her eyelids, but she would not let them fall. Not yet. Not until she had heard everything. What happened to them? She asked. What happened to the captives? The women were returned within a year. The army negotiated their release. But the children? Eli paused, and Clara heard him take a deep, unsteady breath. The children were taken to different bands, separated. It's what they do sometimes, to make it harder to track them down. Your daughter was given to a family in one of the camps that scattered after the Battle of Little Bighorn. I've been trying to find out what happened to her ever since. Clara's eyes flew open. You've been looking for her. For 3 years, that's why I came here, that's why I took this job. I've been following leads, talking to people, trying to trace where she might have ended up. I thought if I could get close to you, learn more about who she was, what she looked like, I might be able to finally track her down. Clara stared at him, her mind struggling to process what he was telling her. All this time she had thought he was her enemy. All this time she had been planning to kill him, and now he was telling her that he had been trying to help her, that he had been looking for Emma. Why? She asked. Why would you do that? You don't even know us. Eli was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached up and pulled the leather cord from around his neck, the one Clara had noticed on his first day at the homestead. Hanging from the cord was a small object, carved from bone, worn smooth by years of handling. It was a figure of a bird, an eagle. My mother made this for me when I was a boy, he said. She told me it would protect me, guide me, help me find my way when I was lost. I've carried it ever since. It's the only thing I have left of her. He held the figure out toward Clara, and she saw that his hand was trembling. When I was 8 years old, my village was attacked by soldiers, not the regular army, militia, volunteers who wanted to teach the savages a lesson. They killed my mother. They killed my grandmother, my aunts, my cousins. They killed everyone I loved. I survived because I was hiding in the woods, checking my snare lines. By the time I got back, everyone was dead. Clara felt something shift inside her. Some wall she had built around her heart began to crack. I know what it's like to lose everything, Eli said. I know what it's like to have your world destroyed by violence you can't understand or control. And I know what it's like to live with the guilt of surviving when everyone else is gone. I've been carrying that weight for more than 20 years. I can't bring back the people I lost. But maybe, just maybe, I can help bring back someone else's child. Maybe that's the only way I'll ever find peace. Clara reached out and took the eagle figure from his hand. It was warm from resting against his chest, and she could feel the grooves where his fingers had worn the bone smooth over years of touching. She held it for a moment, feeling its weight, feeling the history it carried. Then she handed it back. I believe you, she said. Her voice was steady now, the trembling gone. But I need to know everything. Everything you know about Emma, about where she might be, about how we can find her. Can you do that? Eli nodded slowly. He tucked the eagle figure back inside his shirt and met her eyes with a gaze that held no deception, no hidden agenda. Just a weariness so deep it seemed to go beyond exhaustion. "I can tell you what I know," he said, "but I have to warn you. What I know might not be what you want to hear." Clara stood up. She straightened her spine and lifted her chin, assuming the posture of the woman she had been before grief had broken her. The woman who had helped her husband build a homestead out of nothing. The woman who had survived childbirth and drought and blizzards and the 1,000 small disasters that made up life on the frontier. "I've spent 3 years living with the worst my imagination could conjure," she said. "I've imagined every terrible thing that could have happened to my daughter. Whatever you have to tell me, it can't be worse than what I've already pictured in my mind." Eli studied her for a long moment, as if taking her measure. Then he nodded. "All right," he said, "but not here. Not tonight. The journalist, Whitmore, he's in danger. The men who shot him, they weren't just bandits, they were hired by someone who doesn't want the information in that satchel getting out. Someone who has a lot to lose if the truth about the captives comes to light." Clara frowned. "Who?" "I'm not sure yet, but I have my suspicions. There are people in the territories, powerful people, who have been profiting from the Indian Wars, army contractors who sell supplies to both sides, politicians who use the conflict to advance their careers, and there are people on the reservations who have been taking bribes to keep certain captives hidden to make sure they're never returned. Are you saying someone has been deliberately keeping my daughter from me? I'm saying it's possible. The raids in 76, they weren't random. They were coordinated. And the captives who were taken, they weren't chosen at random either. Someone knew which homesteads had children. Someone knew where to strike and when. That kind of information doesn't just appear out of nowhere. Clara felt a cold anger beginning to build in her chest. An anger that was different from the rage she had felt toward the Lakota, different from the hatred that had sustained her through 3 years of grief. This was a focused anger, a purposeful anger, directed at specific targets she could actually reach. "Who?" she said again. "Who would do something like that? That's what we need to find out, and that's why we need to keep Whitmore safe. He's been gathering evidence for months. If we can get him to the authorities, if we can get his documents into the right hands, we might be able to bring down the whole operation. And if we do that, we might finally be able to find out what happened to Emma." Clara looked at Eli for a long moment. He had been her enemy, or so she had believed. He had been the focus of her hatred, the target of her vengeance, and now he was offering her something she had never expected: hope. "All right," she said finally, "what do we do? First we need to find out who shot Whitmore, and why. Then we need to get him out of here, somewhere safe where he can recover, and we can go through his documents properly." And then Eli paused, his expression hardening into something that looked almost like determination. "Then we find Emma. Whatever it takes, whoever we have to go through. We find your daughter, and we bring her home." Clara extended her hand. It was a strange gesture, a man's gesture, but it felt right in that moment. Two people who had been enemies forming an alliance against a common foe. Eli looked at her hand for a moment. Then he reached out and clasped it in his own. His grip was firm and warm, and Clara felt something pass between them. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of something that might become trust, given time. "Partners," she said. "Partners," he agreed. Outside, the wind was picking up, howling around the corners of the barn like something wild and hungry. A storm was coming, sweeping down from the mountains with the first real cold of the season. But inside the barn, in the warm glow of the lantern light, Clara Ashford felt something she had not felt in 3 years. She felt alive. And for the first time since the night her world had ended, she had a reason to keep going. Not just survival, not just endurance, but purpose. A goal she could work toward, a fight she could actually win. She was going to find her daughter, and God help anyone who stood in her way. The next morning dawned grey and cold, with frost rimming the windows and ice crusting the water in the horse trough. Clara was up before sunrise, moving through the house with a new energy that surprised even herself. She made breakfast, checked on Whitmore, who was still feverish but improving, and then sat down at the kitchen table with Eli to plan their next move. The Brennan brothers watched them with curious eyes, but asked no questions. They were good men, loyal men, and Clara knew she could trust them to keep their mouths shut about whatever they saw or heard. But she also knew that the fewer people who knew what they were planning, the safer everyone would be. "We need more information," Eli said, spreading Whitmore's documents across the table. "These records are good, but they're incomplete. There are names missing, connections that don't quite add up. If we're going to find out who's behind this, we need to talk to people who were there, people who know the truth." Clara nodded. She was looking at a list of names, captives who had been returned over the past 3 years. Some of them were marked with notes: returned to family, died in captivity, location unknown. But one name caught her attention, a woman named Margaret Hollister, who had been taken in the same raid that claimed Samuel and Emma. "What about her?" Clara asked, pointing to the name. "She was returned a year after the raid. She might know something." Eli leaned forward to look at the entry. "Hollister," he read. "Yes, I remember her. She was in bad shape when she came back. Wouldn't talk about what had happened, but she might be willing to talk now, especially if she knows someone is finally trying to do something about it. Where is she? Last I heard, she was living in Cheyenne. Her husband took her back. Tried to help her recover. I don't know if she's still there." Clara made a decision. "Then that's where we start. I'll go to Cheyenne and talk to her. You stay here and keep an eye on Whitmore. If whoever shot him comes back, they'll be coming here first." Eli shook his head. "It's too dangerous for you to go alone. These people, whoever they are, they've already tried to kill once. They won't hesitate to do it again. I can take care of myself. I know you can, but that doesn't mean you should have to." Clara looked at him across the table, at this strange man who had appeared in her life like an answer to a prayer she had forgotten how to speak. He was not what she had expected. He was not what she had feared. He was something else entirely, something she did not have a name for yet. "All right," she said, "we'll figure out another way, but we need to move fast. The longer we wait, the harder it will be to find the trail." "Agreed," Eli said. He gathered up the documents and tucked them back into the satchel. "In the meantime, there's someone else we should talk to, someone who might be able to help us understand what's really going on." "Who?" Eli's expression darkened. "A man I used to know. A man who was involved in some of the negotiations I told you about. He works at the Pine Ridge Agency now, but back in '76, he was running supplies for the Army and for the Lakota, both at the same time." Clara felt her jaw tighten. He was playing both sides. More than that. "I think he might have been the one who told the war parties where to strike. I could never prove it, but the timing was always too perfect. Every time we thought we had a lead on where the captives were being held, the camps would move. Someone was warning them. Someone who knew what we were planning before we even did it. And you think this man was the informant? I think he's the place to start looking. His name is Marcus Hale. And if anyone knows what happened to Emma, it's him." Clara committed the name to memory. Marcus Hale, the man who might have sold her daughter to savages for profit, the man who might have destroyed her family for a few dollars and a promise of silence. She felt the old anger stirring in her chest again. But this time, it was not the blind rage of grief. It was something colder, something more dangerous. It was the beginning of justice. The journey to Pine Ridge took 4 days through country that grew wilder and more desolate with every mile. Clara and Eli traveled light, leaving Tom Brennan behind to guard the homestead and watch over Whitmore, who was recovering slowly but steadily. Jack Brennan rode with them as far as the territorial road, then turned back with instructions to send word if anyone came looking for the journalist. The first snow of the season caught them on the second day, a light dusting that turned the prairie white and made the horses' breath steam in the frigid air. Clara rode in silence, her thoughts turning over and over like stones in a river. She had spent 3 years believing her daughter was dead. She had buried that hope along with her husband, tamped it down into the frozen ground, and tried to forget it existed. Now that hope was alive again, burning in her chest like an ember that refused to go out. Eli rode beside her, quiet as always, his eyes scanning the horizon for signs of trouble. He had told her more about Marcus Hale during the long hours on the trail. Hale had started out as a legitimate army contractor, supplying beef and flour to the frontier posts. But somewhere along the way, he had discovered that there was more money to be made by playing both sides. He sold information to the Lakota about army movements and supply routes. He sold information to the army about Lakota camps and war parties. And when captives were taken, he positioned himself as an intermediary, taking a cut of every ransom that changed hands. "He's a snake," Eli had said. "But he's a smart snake. He's never been caught because he's always careful to cover his tracks. He knows everyone on both sides of the conflict, and everyone owes him something. That makes him dangerous." Clara had listened without comment. She did not care how dangerous Marcus Hale was. She did not care what it would take to make him talk. All she cared about was finding Emma. They reached the Pine Ridge Agency on the afternoon of the fourth day. It was a collection of wooden buildings clustered around a central parade ground, surrounded by a sea of Lakota lodges that stretched as far as the eye could see. Thousands of people lived here, confined to this patch of land by treaties they had never wanted to sign. The air smelled of wood smoke and cooking meat, and something else, something harder to identify. Despair, perhaps, or resignation. Clara felt the eyes on her as they rode through the agency gates. Lakota men and women watched from doorways and around cooking fires, their expressions guarded and unreadable. She knew what they saw when they looked at her: a white woman, an intruder, someone who represented everything that had been taken from them. She wondered if Emma had grown up surrounded by faces like these. She wondered if her daughter even remembered that she had once been white. The agency office was a squat wooden building with a sagging porch and a flag that hung limp in the still air. Eli dismounted and tied his horse to the rail, then helped Clara down from her saddle. His hand lingered on her elbow for just a moment, a gesture of support that she accepted without comment. "Let me do the talking," he said quietly. "Hale knows me. He doesn't know you. That might work in our favor." Clara nodded. She followed Eli up the steps and through the door into a cramped office that smelled of dust and old paper. A man sat behind a desk piled high with documents, his head bent over a ledger. He was perhaps 50 years old, with thinning gray hair and a face that had the soft, well-fed look of someone who had never done an honest day's work in his life. "Marcus," Eli said. The man looked up. His eyes widened slightly when he saw Eli, then narrowed with a calculation that Clara recognized immediately. This was a man who was always thinking, always planning, always looking for the angle that would benefit him most. "Walking elk," Hale said. He leaned back in his chair and folded his hands over his belly. "Been a long time. I heard you'd gone east. Figured you'd finally given up on playing Indian." "I never played at anything," Eli said. His voice was calm, but Clara could see the tension in his shoulders, the tightness around his jaw. "I'm here on business." "What kind of business?" "The kind that involves money." "Isn't that the only kind you care about?" Hale smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "That depends on whose money we're talking about." "And who's your friend?" "This is Mrs. Ashford. She's looking for information about a captive, a girl who was taken in the raids in '76. Hale's expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes. 76 was a long time ago. A lot of captives were taken that year. Most of them are dead by now. "This one isn't," Eli said. "At least we don't think so. Her name was Emma Ashford. She was 6 years old when she was taken. Fair hair, blue eyes, taken from a homestead near Broken Ridge." Hale was quiet for a moment. He looked at Clara, studying her face with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "I remember that raid," he said finally. "Nasty business. A lot of people died. My husband among them," Clara said. Her voice came out steadier than she had expected. "Now I want to know what happened to my daughter. And you think I can help with that. I think you know more than you're willing to say. I think you've been involved in this business from the beginning. And I think you're going to tell me what I want to know, one way or another." Hale laughed. It was a thin, unpleasant sound. "You've got spirit, Mrs. Ashford. I'll give you that. But you're out of your depth here. The Indian wars are complicated. There are things going on that you couldn't begin to understand. Try me." Hale looked at Eli. "Is she always like this?" "She has reason to be," Eli said. "We're not leaving without answers, Marcus. You can give them to us willingly, or we can find other ways to persuade you. But either way, we're going to find out what happened to that girl." Something flickered across Hale's face. Fear, perhaps, or the recognition that he was dealing with people who would not be easily turned away. He was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming on the desk in a nervous rhythm. "Fine," he said at last. "I'll tell you what I know, but it's not going to be what you want to hear." Clara leaned forward. "Talk." The girl was taken by a band led by a war chief called Red Cloud's son. Not the famous Red Cloud, a different man, younger, more radical. He was one of the ones who refused to come into the reservation after Little Bighorn. He took his people north into Canada, and they've been living up there ever since. "Is she still alive?" Clara asked. "As far as I know. The last report I had was about a year ago. There was a trader who did business with Red Cloud's son's band. He said there was a white girl living with them, maybe 9 or 10 years old. Fair hair, blue eyes. She'd been adopted by one of the families, raised as Lakota. She didn't even remember her English name anymore." Clara felt the world tilt around her. Emma was alive. Her daughter was alive. She was out there somewhere in the wilderness of Canada, living with the people who had stolen her. But she was alive. "Where exactly?" Clara said. "Where in Canada?" Hale shook his head. "That I don't know. Red Cloud's son moves around, never stays in one place too long. The Canadian authorities have been trying to track him for years, but he always stays one step ahead. He knows the land better than anyone." "How do we find him?" "You don't. Not unless he wants to be found. And he doesn't want to be found by white people, I can tell you that much." Clara stood up so fast her chair scraped back against the wooden floor. There has to be a way. Someone who knows where he camps. Someone who can get a message to him. Hale looked at her with something that might have been pity. "Mrs. Ashford, even if you could find him, what makes you think he'd give the girl up? She's been with them for 3 years. She's Lakota now, for all practical purposes. She probably doesn't even remember you." "She's my daughter," Clara said. The words came out fierce and raw. "I don't care if she remembers me or not. I'm going to find her and I'm going to bring her home." Hale sighed and rubbed his eyes with the heel of his hand. He suddenly looked older, wearier, as if the mask he wore had slipped for just a moment. "There might be one way," he said slowly, "but it's dangerous. And it's going to cost you." "Name your price," Clara said. "It's not about money." "Well, not just about money. There's a man who acts as a go-between for Red Cloud's son. He handles trade, negotiations, that sort of thing. He's the only person I know who might be able to get a message through." "Who is he?" Eli asked. "His name is Jean-Pierre Fontaine. He's a French-Canadian trader who operates out of Fort Walsh up in the Cypress Hills. He's been doing business with the northern bands for 20 years. If anyone can help you find Red Cloud's son, it's him." "What's the catch?" Eli said. "There's always a catch with you, Marcus." Hale smiled thinly. "Fontaine doesn't work for free, and he doesn't work for just anyone. You'll need something to trade, something valuable enough to make it worth his while, and you'll need someone to vouch for you, someone he trusts." "And let me guess," Eli said, "that someone is you. I'm the only one who can get you a meeting with him. Without my introduction, he won't even talk to you." Clara looked at Eli. His expression was troubled, his jaw tight with suppressed anger. She knew what he was thinking. They were being manipulated, drawn deeper into Hale's web with every step. But what choice did they have? "What do you want?" Clara asked Hale. "What's your price for the introduction?" Hale leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "The journalist," he said. "Whitmore, I want his documents." Clara felt a cold shock run through her. "How do you know about Whitmore?" "I know everything that happens in this territory, Mrs. Ashford. It's my business to know. Whitmore has been collecting evidence for months, talking to people, gathering information. Some of that information is very inconvenient for certain people, myself included." "You want us to destroy the evidence against you," Eli said. "I want to protect my interests, just like everyone else in this business. You give me Whitmore's documents, I give you the introduction to Fontaine. Everyone gets what they want." Clara was quiet for a long moment. She thought about Whitmore, lying in the spare bedroom of her homestead, recovering from a bullet that had been meant to silence him forever. She thought about the documents in his satchel, the lists of names and dates and crimes that could bring down an entire network of corruption. And she thought about Emma, somewhere in the Canadian wilderness, living a life that Clara could barely imagine. "No," she said. Hale raised an eyebrow. "No. I won't destroy those documents. Too many people have already suffered because of what you and your friends have done. I won't help you cover it up." "Then I'm afraid we have nothing more to discuss." Clara leaned forward, placing her hands flat on Hale's desk. She looked him directly in the eyes, and what she saw there confirmed everything she had suspected. This was a man who had no conscience, no loyalty, no values beyond his own self-interest. This was a man who had profited from the suffering of others for years, who had watched children being torn from their parents and calculated how much money he could make from their misery. "Let me tell you something, Mr. Hale," she said. Her voice was quiet but steady. "I have spent 3 years living with the worst pain a person can endure. I have buried my husband. I have mourned my daughter. I have stared into the darkness and considered ending my own life more times than I can count. There is nothing you can do to me that is worse than what I have already survived." Hale's smile faltered slightly. "So here is what is going to happen," Clara continued. "You are going to give us the introduction to Fontaine. You are going to tell us everything you know about Red Cloud's son and where we might find him. And in exchange, I will not take Whitmore's documents to the territorial authorities myself. I will not tell them about your involvement in the raids, your deals with the Lakota, your betrayal of everyone who ever trusted you. I will let you go on living your miserable little life, counting your blood money and looking over your shoulder for the rest of your days. And if I refuse—" Clara straightened up. "If you refuse, I will burn this agency to the ground with you inside it. And then I will find Fontaine myself without your help. It might take longer, it might be harder, but I will find him. And I will find my daughter. The only question is whether you will be alive to see it happen." The silence that followed was absolute. Hale stared at Clara, his face pale, his mouth slightly open. He looked at Eli, perhaps hoping to find an ally, but Eli's expression was stone. "She means it," Eli said quietly, "and so do I." Hale swallowed hard. He reached for a piece of paper on his desk, his hand trembling slightly, and began to write. "Fontaine operates out of Fort Walsh," he said as he wrote. "He comes down to trade every few months, but the best way to reach him is to go north yourself. Take the trail through the Cypress Hills and ask for him at the Hudson's Bay Post. Tell him Marcus Hale sent you. Tell him you're looking for Red Cloud's son's band." He paused, looking up at Clara. "And tell him you're willing to pay whatever it takes." He handed her the paper. It contained a rough map and a few lines of introduction in French. "This is all I can give you," Hale said. "The rest is up to you." Clara took the paper and folded it carefully into her pocket. She looked at Hale one last time, memorizing his face, the fear in his eyes, the sweat beading on his forehead. "If I find out you've warned Fontaine against us," she said, "if I find out you've done anything to interfere with my search for my daughter, I will come back here. And next time, I won't bother with threats." She turned and walked out of the office without looking back. Eli followed, closing the door behind them with a soft click. Outside, the sky had turned the color of lead, and the first flakes of a new snow were beginning to fall. Clara stood on the porch of the agency building, breathing in the cold air, trying to calm the pounding of her heart. "That was impressive," Eli said quietly. Clara shook her head. "I was terrified. You didn't show it. I couldn't afford to." Eli was quiet for a moment. Then he reached out and put his hand on her shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but it carried more meaning than any words could have expressed. "We're going to find her," he said. "I promise you that." Clara looked at him, at this man who had been her enemy and was now her ally. She saw the conviction in his eyes, the determination that matched her own, and for the first time since this journey had begun, she allowed herself to believe that it might actually be possible. "I know," she said, and then, surprising herself, she added, "Thank you." They rode out of Pine Ridge that afternoon, heading north toward the Canadian border. The snow was falling harder now, covering the tracks behind them, erasing all evidence of their passing. Ahead lay hundreds of miles of wilderness, a foreign country, and a man named Jean-Pierre Fontaine, who might or might not be willing to help them. But Clara did not care about the obstacles. She did not care about the cold or the danger or the uncertainty. All she cared about was the piece of paper in her pocket, the map that would lead her to her daughter. Emma was alive, and Clara was going to bring her home, whatever it took. The Cypress Hills rose from the plains like the spine of some great sleeping beast, their dark forests dusted with snow that had been falling for 3 days without pause. Clara and Eli had crossed the border into Canada a week ago, traveling through country so vast and empty that Clara sometimes felt as if they were the only two people left in the world. The cold was brutal, seeping through every layer of clothing and settling into her bones like a sickness that would never leave. They found Fort Walsh on the 12th day, a huddle of wooden buildings surrounded by a stockade fence that seemed pitifully inadequate against the immensity of the wilderness. The Hudson's Bay trading post sat at the edge of the compound, its chimney sending a thin stream of smoke into the leaden sky. Clara dismounted stiffly, her legs numb from the cold, and followed Eli inside. The interior was warm and close, smelling of tobacco and fur and the particular mustiness of goods that had traveled thousands of miles to reach this remote outpost. A man stood behind the counter, heavy-set and bearded, watching them with the wary eyes of someone who had learned not to trust strangers. "We're looking for Jean-Pierre Fontaine," Eli said. The man's expression did not change. Never heard of him. Eli reached into his coat and pulled out the letter Hale had written. "Marcus Hale sent us. He said Fontaine could help us find someone." The man took the letter and read it slowly, his lips moving slightly as he worked through the words. Then he looked up at Clara, studying her face with an intensity that made her want to look away. "You're the mother," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." The man nodded slowly. He folded the letter and tucked it into his pocket. "Wait here. I'll send word." He disappeared through a door at the back of the shop. Clara and Eli waited in silence, warming themselves by the iron stove in the corner. An hour passed, then two. The daylight faded outside the frost-covered windows, and the shadows in the shop grew long and dark. Finally, the door opened again, and a man stepped through. He was tall and lean, with weathered skin and eyes the color of winter ice. His hair was grey and hung past his shoulders, and he wore a mixture of European and native clothing that spoke of a life lived between two worlds. "I am Fontaine," he said. His accent was thick, the words shaped by a French tongue that had never quite learned to speak English comfortably. "Hale says you are looking for Red Cloud's son." "We are," Clara said. She stepped forward, her heart pounding against her ribs. "He has my daughter. She was taken 3 years ago." Fontaine studied her for a long moment. Then he looked at Eli, recognition flickering in his pale eyes. "Walking Elk," he said. "I remember you. You were at the negotiations after Little Bighorn." "I was," Eli said. "You argued for mercy for the survivors. You said the killing had to stop. It did have to stop. It still does." Fontaine was quiet. He walked to the stove and held his hands out toward the warmth, his back to them. "Red Cloud's son is not an easy man to find," he said at last. "He does not trust white people. He has good reason not to. His father was killed at Wounded Knee. His mother died of smallpox on the reservation. He has lost everything to your people, and he has sworn never to surrender." "I'm not asking him to surrender," Clara said. "I'm asking him to give me back my child." Fontaine turned to face her. "And what will you give in return?" "Whatever he wants, whatever it takes. Even if what he wants is for you to leave and never come back. Even if he tells you that your daughter is dead, or that she no longer wishes to be white, or that she has forgotten you exist." Clara felt the words like blows, each one striking at the hope she had been nurturing for weeks, but she did not look away. She did not let her voice falter. Even then, she said, "I have to know. Whatever the truth is, I have to know." Fontaine was silent for a long time. The fire crackled in the stove. The wind howled outside, driving snow against the walls of the trading post. "I will take you to him," Fontaine said finally. "But I make no promises about what will happen when we arrive. Red Cloud's son will decide for himself whether to see you, and he will decide for himself whether to let the girl go." "Thank you," Clara whispered. "Thank you." Fontaine held up a hand. "Do not thank me yet. The journey is long and dangerous. We must travel through territory where the mounted police are hunting for the very people we seek. If we are caught, we will be arrested, possibly imprisoned. And if we reach the camp and Red Cloud's son decides we are a threat, he will kill us without hesitation." "I understand," Clara said. Fontaine looked at her with something that might have been respect. "We leave at dawn," he said. "Get some rest, you will need it." The journey north took 9 days. They traveled through forests so thick that the sky was barely visible, across frozen rivers that groaned and cracked beneath their horses' hooves, over mountain passes where the snow was waist-deep and the wind cut like a knife. Clara had never been so cold, so exhausted, so close to giving up. But every time she felt her strength failing, she thought of Emma, and she found the will to keep going. Fontaine proved to be a capable guide, leading them through the wilderness with an ease that spoke of decades of experience. He told them stories as they traveled, tales of the fur trade and the old days before the wars, before the reservations, before the world had changed beyond recognition. He spoke of the Lakota with respect, even admiration, describing a people who had once been the masters of the northern plains and who were now fighting for their very survival. On the 10th day, they crested a ridge and looked down into a valley where a circle of lodges stood beside a frozen stream. Smoke rose from the cooking fires, and Clara could see figures moving between the tents, going about the daily business of life. It looked peaceful. It looked like home. "Wait here," Fontaine said. He dismounted and walked down into the valley alone, his hands raised to show he carried no weapons. Clara watched him go, her heart in her throat. She could feel Eli beside her, solid and reassuring, but she could not look at him. She could only stare at the camp below, searching for a glimpse of fair hair among the dark heads, searching for some sign of the daughter she had lost. An hour passed. The sun moved across the sky, casting long shadows across the snow. Finally, Fontaine emerged from one of the lodges and waved for them to come down. Clara's legs were trembling as she rode into the camp. The people watched her with expressions that ranged from curiosity to hostility, but no one moved to stop her. Fontaine led them to the largest lodge, where a man stood waiting. Red Cloud's son was younger than Clara had expected, perhaps 40 years old, with a face that bore the marks of a hard life and eyes that held no warmth. He wore a buffalo robe over his shoulders and a single eagle feather in his hair. He looked at Clara without speaking, his gaze measuring her, judging her. "You are the mother," he said at last. His English was halting but clear. "Yes," Clara said. She dismounted and walked toward him, her hands open at her sides. "I have come for my daughter. The girl you seek is not your daughter, not anymore. She is Lakota now. She has a Lakota name, a Lakota family, a Lakota life. She was born my daughter. She will always be my daughter." Red Cloud's son was silent. He looked at Eli, then at Fontaine, then back at Clara. "Why should I give her up?" he said. "Your people have taken everything from us, our land, our buffalo, our freedom. Why should I give you anything?" Clara took a deep breath. "Because she deserves to know the truth. She deserves to know where she came from, who her people were. Even if she chooses to stay with you, even if she never wants to see me again, she deserves to know." Red Cloud's son studied her for a long moment. Then, without a word, he turned and walked into the lodge. Clara waited. The cold seeped through her coat, her boots, her gloves. She could feel her heart beating, slow and heavy, counting out the seconds of her life. And then the lodge flap opened and a girl stepped out. She was 9 years old, tall for her age, with fair hair that had been braided in the Lakota style, and skin that had been darkened by years of sun and wind. She wore a deerskin dress decorated with beadwork, and her feet were clad in moccasins lined with rabbit fur. She looked at Clara with eyes that were blue, startlingly blue, the same blue that Clara saw every time she looked in a mirror. "Emma," Clara whispered. The girl frowned. She said something in Lakota, a question directed at Red Cloud's son. He responded in the same language, his voice low and gentle. The girl looked at Clara again. This time, there was something in her eyes, a flicker of recognition, perhaps, or maybe just curiosity. "I am called Morning Star," she said. Her English was rusty, the words coming slowly as if from a great distance. "I do not remember another name." Clara felt the tears streaming down her face, hot against her frozen skin. She did not try to stop them. "Your name was Emma," she said. "Emma Rose Ashford. You were born on a spring morning when the wildflowers were blooming on the prairie. Your father held you in his arms and said you were the most beautiful thing he had ever seen." The girl, Morning Star, Emma, was silent. Her brow was furrowed, her expression troubled. "I remember flowers," she said slowly. "I remember a house made of wood. I remember a woman who sang to me at night." "That was me," Clara said. "I sang to you every night until you were taken from me." Something shifted in the girl's face, a crack in the wall she had built around the memories she could not quite reach. "I remember the singing," she said. "I remember it stopped." Clara took a step forward. She wanted to run to her daughter, to gather her in her arms, and never let go. But she forced herself to move slowly, carefully, as if approaching a wild animal that might bolt at any moment. "I never stopped," she said. "I sang to you every night, even after you were gone. I sang to the empty room because it was the only way I could feel close to you." Emma looked at her. The wariness was still there, the uncertainty. But there was something else now. Something that looked almost like longing. Red Cloud's son spoke. "The girl is free to choose," he said. "She can go with you if she wishes. Or she can stay here, with the people who have raised her." Emma looked at him, then at the camp around her, at the lodges and the people who had become her family. Then she looked back at Clara. "I do not know you," she said. "I do not remember you. But I remember the singing, and I remember feeling safe." Clara held out her hand. It was trembling, but she did not try to hide it. "Come with me," she said. "Let me show you who you were. Let me help you remember. And if, after you know everything, you want to come back here, I will bring you back myself, I promise." Emma hesitated. The moment stretched out, thin and fragile as ice on a spring pond. Then she reached out and took Clara's hand. Her fingers were small and cold, but they gripped Clara's with a strength that surprised her. Clara pulled her daughter close, wrapping her arms around her, feeling the thin shoulders, the rapid heartbeat, the warmth of a living body against her own. For the first time in 3 years, Clara Ashford smiled. The journey back to Wyoming took nearly a month. The weather was brutal, with blizzards that trapped them in makeshift camps for days at a time, and cold so intense that Clara feared they would freeze to death before they reached civilization. But they survived. They kept moving, one step at a time, 1 mile at a time, until finally the mountains gave way to the familiar rolling plains of home. Emma Morningstar was quiet for most of the journey. She watched everything with wary eyes, speaking only when spoken to, keeping a distance that Clara understood even as it broke her heart. The girl had spent 3 years building a life among the Lakota. She had learned their language, their customs, their way of seeing the world. She could not simply shed that identity like a worn-out coat. But slowly, gradually, things began to change. Emma started asking questions about the homestead, about the horses, about the life she could barely remember. She let Clara brush her hair at night, sitting still while Clara worked out the tangles and murmured stories about the baby she had once been. And one evening, as they sat around the campfire with Eli keeping watch nearby, Emma looked at Clara and said something that made everything worthwhile. "I remember your face now," she said. "I remember you holding me when I was scared." Clara pulled her daughter close, tears streaming down her face. "I will always hold you when you're scared," she said. "Always. No matter what." They reached the homestead in late January, just as the first hints of spring were beginning to show in the lengthening days. Tom Brennan was waiting on the porch, his face breaking into a grin when he saw them riding up the drive. "Mrs. Ashford," he called out. "Thank God. We were starting to think you'd never come back." Clara dismounted and helped Emma down from the horse. "This is my daughter," she said. "Emma. She's come home." Tom's eyes widened. He looked at the girl, at her Lakota clothing and braided hair, and for a moment Clara saw the question in his expression. But he was a good man, and he knew when to keep his thoughts to himself. "Welcome home, miss," he said. "It's good to have you here." Whitmore was waiting inside, fully recovered from his wound and eager to hear about their journey. He listened as Clara told the story, his pen moving rapidly across the pages of his notebook. "This is extraordinary," he said when she had finished. "The corruption, the cover-ups, the children who were never returned. This story needs to be told." Clara nodded. "Tell it," she said. "Tell all of it. The world needs to know what happened here." Eli stayed for a week after they returned, helping with the chores and making sure Clara and Emma were settled. On the morning he was set to leave, Clara found him in the barn, saddling his horse. "Where will you go?" she asked. "South, I think. There are other families looking for their children, other captives who might still be found. You're going to keep looking. It's all I know how to do." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she reached out and took his hand. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. I couldn't have done this without you." Eli looked at her, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw something soft in his expression, something warm. "You would have found a way," he said. "You're the strongest person I've ever met." Clara smiled. It still felt strange on her face, that expression she had forgotten how to make, but it was getting easier. "Will you come back?" she asked. "When you can." Eli nodded. "I'll come back," he said. "I promise." He rode out that morning, disappearing into the vast expanse of the prairie. Clara watched him go until he was nothing but a speck on the horizon, then turned and walked back to the house. Emma was sitting at the kitchen table, looking at the photograph on the mantel. The one of Samuel and Emma taken 3 years ago in another lifetime. "Is that my father?" she asked. "Yes," Clara said. She sat down beside her daughter and put her arm around her shoulders. "His name was Samuel. He loved you very much." Emma was quiet for a long moment. Then she leaned against Clara, her head resting on her mother's shoulder. "Tell me about him," she said. Clara began to talk. She told Emma about Samuel, about how they had met, about how he had dreamed of building a life on the frontier. She told her about the homestead, about the horses, about the garden Clara had planted the spring Emma was born. She told her about the night of the raid, and about the 3 years of grief that had followed. And as she talked, Clara felt something shifting inside her. The ice that had encased her heart for so long was beginning to thaw. The darkness that had consumed her was beginning to lift. She had her daughter back. She had a reason to live, and for the first time in 3 years she had hope. Outside, the sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. A new day was ending, but for Clara Ashford and her daughter Emma, a new life was just beginning. Spring came early that year. The snow melted, the grass turned green, and the wildflowers bloomed across the prairie in waves of color that seemed to stretch to the edge of the world. Clara planted a garden. Emma helped her, learning the names of the vegetables and the proper way to tend them. Slowly, day by day, they built a life together. It was not easy. There were nightmares for both of them. There were days when Emma retreated into herself, speaking only in Lakota, refusing to answer to her English name. There were moments when Clara wondered if she had made a terrible mistake, if her daughter would have been happier staying with the people who had raised her. But there were good days too. Days when Emma laughed at something Clara said, days when she called her mother without thinking about it, days when they sat together on the porch at sunset, watching the sky change colors, and Clara felt something that she had forgotten was possible. Peace. Eli returned in June, riding up the drive with a smile on his face and news that made Clara's heart sing. The network of corruption that Marcus Hale had been part of was being dismantled. Whitmore's articles had caused a sensation, and the government had launched an investigation. Several men had already been arrested, and more would follow. And there were other children, Eli said, other captives who had been found and returned to their families. Not all of them, not nearly enough, but some. And that was a start. Clara listened, and she smiled, and she felt the last of the ice around her heart finally melt away. That evening after supper, Emma asked if she could brush the horses. Clara watched her go, watched her daughter walk across the yard with the easy grace she had learned from her years among the Lakota. She was growing up. She was healing. They both were. Eli came to stand beside her on the porch. The sunset painted his face in shades of gold, softening the sharp angles, making him look almost young. "She's doing well," he said. "She is," Clara agreed. "Better every day." "And you?" Clara considered the question. A year ago, she would not have known how to answer. A year ago, she had been dead inside, going through the motions of life without actually living. "I'm doing well too," she said, and she meant it. Eli reached out and took her hand. His fingers were warm and rough, calloused from years of hard work. Clara let him hold on, let herself feel the comfort of another person's touch. "I was thinking," Eli said slowly. "There's a lot of work to be done around here. More than one person can handle alone." Clara looked at him. "Are you offering to stay if you'll have me?" Clara was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the homestead, at the barn and the corral and the garden she had planted. She looked at Emma, laughing as one of the horses nuzzled her palm. She looked at Eli, at this man who had started as her enemy and become her friend, and might yet become something more. "I'd like that," she said. Eli smiled. It was a good smile, warm and genuine, transforming his face into something almost handsome. "Then I'll stay," he said. They stood together on the porch, watching the sun sink below the horizon. The sky turned from gold to rose to purple, and the first stars began to appear. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and the horses stirred in the corral. Clara Ashford, the homesteader who never smiled, leaned against the man who had helped her find her daughter. And as the night settled over the Wyoming prairie, she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt happy, and this time she knew it would last.